My name is Sarah Bostic, and I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Extension Agent in both Sarasota and DeSoto counties down here on the west coast of Florida. I'm typically joined by my coworker, Carol Wyatt Evans, who's the Chemicals and the Environment Agent. I think she'll be joining us shortly. She's just finishing teaching a class on insects. But I am indeed today joined by my wonderful coworker, Mindy Hannock, who is the School and Community Garden Coordinator in Sarasota County. And I am actually in a room with one of our fantastic Master Gardener volunteers, who's been busy today volunteering on some major landscaping projects happening at our office. So this webinar series, Monday to 12:30-ish, on a variety of topics around. I'm really excited to announce that Carol and I have had so much fun doing this series and gotten such great feedback from all of y'all that we've actually created another 10 classes on totally other different topics related to edible gardening that we're going to teach from late January through the end of March in 2021. So you can find those now on Eventbrite. So this is session number 9. I can't believe we're at session 9 already. Fertilizing your garden. And as most of y'all have heard us say before, the reason that we created this series in the first place is because we have so many people who come through our office or get in touch with us to say that they're just really struggling with figuring out how to successfully grow things in Florida. And so we created this series with that in mind, but everything that we talk about is also relevant regardless of where you happen to be in the world. So here we go. We're going to dive right into session 9, fertilizing your garden. So this can be a really overwhelming topic. And it's one of those topics that seems really, really straightforward on a lot of levels. And it turns out it's really not. And in large part, it's because every soil is made differently. And every source of fertilizer or fertility is also made differently. So figuring out how to, do something as simple as read the back of a fertilizer bag or figure out, what your plants actually need can actually be a really, really deep subject. So on just a really brief overview, this picture, which is not all that in focus on your screen, I'm sure, because it's a pretty low resolution photo, but this is basically a hand drawing of what different nutrient deficiencies can look like in your plants, right? So all of the major plant nutrients that plants need to stay healthy and be productive and resilient and resistant to diseases and pests and things like that, they're right there on your screen. And so first, as a starting point, I think it's really important to just say that when we talk about fertilizer or fertilizing, it's
Sarah,
not just,
I'm sorry, but your screen isn't moving. Your slides aren't advancing.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Let's see. Yeah, my screen looks different than it ever has before, and I am not sure why.
I can see on my end, it looks like it didn't trigger it into a slideshow.
Okay, that's very helpful information. I'm gonna start again, see if it'll work this time around. Is that advancing?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, okay. I have no idea what happened the first time around. Thank you so much for stopping me. Okay, so there we go. Can you see that plant drawing? Great. Okay, so when we talk about fertilizing, what we're really talking about is giving plants the really essential basic nutrients that they need to do what they do best, which is be productive and healthy, active plants. And there's so many different nutrients that plants need to properly function. When you read a fertilizer bag, often what you see is actually just 3 nutrients that are being listed: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are indeed 3 of the nutrients that plants need. And they're called we generally refer to them as macronutrients. And that's because those are the nutrients that plants need in the largest quantities, or macro quantities. But it doesn't make them more important than the other nutrients. It just means plants need more of it compared to other nutrients, but they are not more important. So the other list of nutrients that plants also need are the nutrients that we generally refer to as micronutrients. And that's because plants need just a little bit of them. They're not less important. Plants just need them in smaller quantities. And so you can see what some of those effects can have, like copper. That's a good example of copper, iron, boron, sulfur, magnesium. You can see some of those micronutrients, if a plant doesn't have what it needs, can actually have some really major physical effects on a plant. So what do you do with that information? So if you've never had a soil test before, it's a really great idea, at least once in your life, at least once in your garden's life rather, to do a soil test, just to give you a good idea of what the starting point is for your soil. And there's a few different things you might want to test your soil for, including those micro and macronutrients. Other things you might want to test your soil for are organic matter, which is the part of soil that actually is able to hold on to nutrients and water. pH is also a really important thing to understand about your soil. And I'll talk more in just a second about how pH comes into play. Salinity in our really coastal areas is also something that is worth testing for if you're struggling with your garden's health and you can't figure out why. Salinity is basically a test that helps you figure out whether or not you have too much salt in your soil for most plants to be happy and healthy. And then if you live in an urban area, it's a good idea if you're growing right into the soil in your urban area to also test for lead and a handful of other heavy metals. It's a pretty typical thing to find in urban soils. So your soil test will actually help you pick the right fertilizer. It's kind of overwhelming when you walk into a hardware store and look at all the options on the shelf, but that test will help you figure out what the best option is. So the reason that it is really helpful to test for pH, that is actually on this chart. This is a really overwhelming chart to look at, but it's a really, really brilliant chart. So you can see kind of running through the middle of this chart in those white bands are the names of most of the micro and macronutrients that plants need to stay really healthy. And then across the top of that chart, there's a number that runs from 4 through 10. And that's basically the full range that plants can possibly survive in. Plants have a pH, most plants require a pH that's much more in the middle of that chart. And the reason that plants are so sensitive to pH and why it's a really good idea to get your soil tested if you never have, just to get an idea of where things stand, is because the pH of your soil actually affects how available those nutrients that are in your soil are to plants. And so the way you look at this chart is, for example, this band of iron right here, you can see that the band for iron is much larger in these pHs that are pretty acidic, like running through 4 through about 6.5. And that means that iron is much more available to your plants at that really low pH. But when you start getting into the higher pHs of like 7 through, like 9, somewhere in there, iron is barely available to your plants chemically. The actual chemical form of iron gets bound up differently and locked away so that plants can't actually access it. So this picture right here that you can see on your screen, that's actually a strawberry plant that had plenty of iron in its soil if it had had a lower pH. But the pH that this strawberry was growing in actually had a pH of about 8.7, which is very, very high. And so even though there was iron in the soil of that strawberry plant, the plant couldn't access it. And so it looked really strange. It grew kind of funny. It produced these really strange, hard little fruits that barely had any sweetness. So that's the effect that something as seemingly simple as pH can have on your soil. So even if you're just curious about what the pH of your soil might be, even if you're not having any effects, most extension offices across Florida can actually test for pH right in the office. Okay, so you get your soil tested, you get those soil tests back. What do you do with those tests, right? So those tests will help you pick the right fertilizer for what you need. And then you still have to figure out how to use that fertilizer. Well, the directions on the back of fertilizer bags are kind of notoriously confusing, right? And it's really important though to actually follow the directions on that fertilizer bag, regardless of how confusing they are. And you may be able to see on your screen here, this is for example, this is just a random bag of fertilizer I happen to have that I took in our office that I took a picture of. So you can see here, there's different instructions for tomatoes, peppers, herbs, compared to eggplant, corn, beans, cucumbers, lettuce, broccoli, compared to carrots, onions, potatoes, beets, etc. Whatever etc. means. So the directions are not always the most straightforward, the most clear, but it's really important to read those directions for a number of reasons. In general, if you're using a granular type fertilizer, you really don't need to fertilize very often. You can see in general that these instructions, are saying, every 2 months or every other month, don't feed carrots mid-season, those sorts of things. So, if you're using a granular fertilizer, once you figure out those instructions, you usually only have to use it once or twice a season. Okay, so this is a question we get a lot in our office. Should I buy organic or synthetic fertilizer? And that's totally a personal decision. And we also get a lot of questions from folks asking about how to know they're actually buying the fertilizer that they think they're buying. We get a lot of folks that say, I want to make sure that I am buying an organic fertilizer. How do I know? So that symbol that you see on your screen right there, listed, that's the symbol you want to look for on packaging. That lets you know that what you're buying would be a product that you could use on a certified organic operation. But regardless of the fertilizer you choose, like I just said, make sure you really read those instructions on the back. I think as humans, we all have this tendency to think, well, a little bit's good, maybe more is even better. And in the case of fertilizer, it's really not. In the case of fertilizer, you can actually create a lot of problems by over fertilizing. One of which is that in our really sandy soils, and you can see here, this is actually this picture you can see on your screen. That right there is the most typical soil type in Sarasota County, where our office is located. This is called Miaka fine sand, and somebody just basically dug a huge deep pit in the ground and took a picture of all the natural layers of soil. And you can see here, once a nutrient passes through this topsoil layer of our soil, it goes through this really white, kind of bleached out looking section. This is a layer of soil called called the zone of leaching. And the zone of leaching is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically that once a nutrient passes into that zone, it leaches right out. Plants can't really access it anymore. And it actually ends up in our surface water and groundwater. That's not a good thing. So that's a really good reason to not over fertilize. Plants can only take up a little bit at a time. The second is that when you over fertilize, some plants take up a little too much, and it can actually make them start to grow too fast. They don't have as much resilience when they're trying to fight a disease, and you can actually make things like aphid infestations worse by giving them too much fertilizer. So we also get a lot of questions about where do you put that fertilizer? So it depends a little bit. So if you are using a granular fertilizer, like not liquid, but a granular fertilizer, it's really important to actually mix it into the soil. If you just leave it kind of as a band on top, if it's a natural product made of like animal and plant byproducts, you'll attract critters that'll come and want to eat your fertilizer. And conventional or organic fertilizers that are left on top can actually just really quickly wash off. So you do want to incorporate them pretty well into the soil. If you put them right into your planting hole, there's a good possibility you can actually burn the roots. And then liquid fertilizers kind of come in two different categories. One are conventional or synthetic fertilizers. And those are fertilizers that are, plants are meant to just drink it up basically with the water that you're giving them. And you can go about that in two different ways. If you have potted plants, you may actually have best success from bottom feeding, AKA putting that nutrient-rich water in the dish or the pot, like the bottom of the pot that you're using. you can also water from the top, the soil around the plant. And then if you're using some sort of like natural product, like a sea-based liquid fertilizer from something like seaweed or rotten fish byproduct, which is more nicely called fish emulsion, it's basically exactly the same. You can either bottom feed or water the soil. And you can also use those products to do a light foliar feed, AKA water the leaves of the plant. And that helps the plants sometimes with really stressful situations. They can absorb a very small amount of what they need through their leaves. So this is a picture actually of little parsley seedlings right here that have been growing in a tray. They're almost ready to be transplanted. And you can see here, there's this strange green film that's kind of on the top of those seedlings. Those are seedlings that probably stayed a little bit too wet, and they got a good bit of, they probably got a little more nutrients than they needed. That's actually a film of algae growing on top. That's a pretty good, what's the word? Oops, we got some, Mindy, do you mind muting some people? I think we've got a few people unmuted. Thank you. That's a good sign. Some over fertilization that happened of those seedlings. So a lot of folks really like using compost in their gardens. I love using compost. And just keep in mind that not all compost is created equal. I know one of the things that a lot of folks who have just recently moved to Florida are really surprised about is that compost looks really, really different than the compost they were used to living somewhere further north. Most of the compost that you can buy in bulk further north of us has a good bit of animal manure mixed into it, because there's a lot of dairies and other things like that where manure is collected and disposed of through a composting system. We don't actually have many dairies in Florida or other confinement animal scenarios. And so most of the compost you can access down here actually has no animal products in it. And so it's just a really different kind of compost than you're probably used to. It's mostly landscape waste. And so just want to put the caveat out there, because so much of it is landscape waste, you do run the risk of there being some residual herbicide in that compost. So just be aware of that. If you're buying bulk compost, you can absolutely ask the company you're buying from for an analysis of their compost. They should have that on hand and should provide it to you when you ask. So these are some of the ways you can go about compost in our area, or learning about compost in our area. In Sarasota County, we have a great nonprofit in our area called Sunshine Community Compost. They do classes as well as community-based composting. And another agent in our office also has a really fun composting series called Black Gold Composting. You can find that on our Eventbrite listing. And then there's all sorts of commercial type compost bins that are also available. And then manure, just want to throw out a quick word on manure. So manure is another one of those. It's a little bit tricky down here. It's a little bit different than the types of manure you might get your hands on in a different part of the country. And one reason for that is simply that down here in Florida and across a lot of the Deep South, we have a truly tremendous amount of weeds that pop up in pastures and hayfields. Many of those weeds are actually toxic to livestock. And so producers down here are much more likely to use persistent herbicide on their hay and pasture fields than farmers in a lot of the other parts of the country are that don't deal with the toxic weed pressure that producers down here do. Some of the persistent herbicides can actually come out the other end of an animal, out of the other end of a horse or a cow or any other type of livestock, totally intact. They can make it through the composting process totally intact and continue to persist in your soil for another 20 years or so. So in general, unless you have a manure source that you can test before using it, it's really probably a better idea to avoid using locally sourced manure down in this area. A lot of folks, maybe haven't put herbicide on a hay field for 10 years. but it's still possible that there might actually be some degree of residual herbicide that the hayfield is taking up. So just take that with a grain of salt. Just know that that is a possibility. So all that to say, there's so many different ways that you can access fertility and fertilizer and build up your soil and provide plants with what they need. It's one of those that I wish there was a magic bullet. I could just give you a formula and you could plug it in. And that's just, unfortunately, not how it works, but it's always a great learning process. So I am going to stop sharing right now. Thank you all so very, very much, as always. We absolutely love starting our week with all of you.